The last few months have seen brand new processors launch from both AMD and Intel in the hope of being branded as the world's best processors. Not only for single and multi-core performance, but on the high end, it seems like both teams had their eyes squarely focused on being deemed as the world's very best gaming processor. So today, we're going to find out which one can really take that crown, coupled with an RTX 4090. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor.
Andy, what are you watching?
It's not what you think.
Wow, it's so big.
Why, thank you. It's the new AOC AG493 UCX, 49 inches of pure performance and a refresh rate of 120 Hz. It's so fast. You can even do two at a time.
What?
You can connect two devices at a time and split the screen. With FreeSync Premium Pro, a 32:9 aspect ratio and a built-in KVM, you'll be finished in no time. Gaming, I mean. What did you think I mean? Get your mind out the gutter and click the link in the description to find out more. So let's talk about what we have here from both camps, with the AMD Ryzen 9 7950X and Intel Core i9 13900K. Now in terms of specs, they are very similar, but also quite different, with the Ryzen 9 sporting 16 physical cores, all with hyperthreading, while the 13900K does things a little differently, with 8 performance cores, which include hyperthreading, so 16 cores, along with 16 efficiency cores that don't have hyperthreading. Now I'm sure you're all bored of me going through what the difference is with performance cores, efficiency cores, and how they differ, as we do actually have tons of other content going through that for you to check out. So I'm not really going to touch too much on that. Now, the other area where things get quite similar is the max boost clock, or turbo frequency, where the Intel wins this battle in a pure numbers game, boosting to 5.8 GHz compared to the lowly 5.7 GHz on the Ryzen 9. So still not slow, but it's almost like it's become a bit of a game as to who can get what out of their respective chips, just to one-up the competition. Now I know there's going to be some people yelling about the Ryzen 7 7700X and the 5800X 3D, and we will have content on them in the very near future as a head-to-head, as there is actually an argument for both. But there's also an argument against them, with the likes of the 5800X 3D not offering any support for the latest technologies like DDR5, as well as the 7700X being great for gaming, but not offering the same level of performance in other tasks that both CPUs we're looking at today can offer. Now, before you go raging in the comments, I hope that's given you kind of the idea on our thinking today of why we are looking at these two particular processors. This is a pure and simple head-to-head, especially as the AMD flagship comes in slightly more expensive at $700 in the US and £750 in the UK, compared to the i9 13900K, which comes in slightly cheaper at $620 in the US and £650 in the UK. Though deals can be had on both at the time of filming, due to Black Friday, prices are kind of all over the place. So I guess there's an argument for both CPUs, especially if the Ryzen comes out on top, because you have to ask if it's then worth the extra. Though if Intel win, then you have to query what you're getting extra for your money with the Ryzen, if it's, not able to keep up. Either way, it makes for a great talking piece that I want to open up to our fans to actually see, even when faced with the facts, because I know there's a pool of consumers out there who will defend each brand's product until they are literally blue in the face. Now, to keep things as fair as possible, we've used all of the same parts where possible, but being on different platforms, that's not always achievable. So for the AMD system, we use the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master with 32GB of G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo, 6000 MHz Expo memory, while the Intel system used the Asus Z790 Maximus Extreme motherboard with 32GB of G.Skill Trident Z5 RGB, 6000 MHz XMP memory. Now for the graphics card, which is arguably the most important part when comparing gaming performance, we use the Inno3D RTX 4090 iChill X3OC to really push each of these CPUs to their max, as we will more than likely experience some level of bottleneck, especially at lower resolutions, because we will be going over 1080p, 1440p and 4K results, which will also show how performance scales with the current world's fastest GPU. Now we've tested 30 games in total, and we'll go over as much data as we physically can, along with looking at averages at each resolution to get kind of better understanding of how each CPU compares to each other, along with looking at cost per frame to see if the slightly cheaper price on the 13900K can chalk up a better value for money argument, which is generally something we've seen AMD winning on in the past. Also, for complete transparency, all test systems were run using the latest respective BIOS. The GPU driver for the RTX 4090 was Nvidia's 526.47 driver, and everything was run on Windows 11 21H2, as newer versions are said to nerf performance on the AMD platform. So, let's take a look at those glorious benchmarks. So starting things off with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and straight away we start to see some very similar results between the two processors, with the Ryzen 9 7950X coming out on top in terms of the averages by anywhere between 2 to 4%, while in the 1% lows we saw a greater gain of anywhere between 7 and 9% across all three resolutions. As we move on to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, we again see very similar results between the two processors, with the Ryzen 9 7950X just edging ahead by around 1 to 2% in both the averages and the 1% lows across all resolutions. That aside, it's good to see that both processors are able to really harness the pure power and performance of the RTX 4090 at 4K with frame rates exceeding 120 FPS. In Cyberpunk on the high preset, we again see very similar numbers with only a few frames per second in it, and at 1440p in favour of the i9 13900K. While at 1080p and 4K, both CPUs ended up performing exactly the same. Though what is interesting is that the 13900K did present better 1% lows, which was especially evident at 1440p, where it had an uplift of around 5.5% compared to the Ryzen processor. Though with lows of 108 frames per second, those gains aren't exactly going to be noticeable at such a high frame rate anyway. In Death Stranding, which is a visually beautiful looking game, we do find again very similar results at 1080p, likely caused by some form of bottleneck, as the RTX 4090 is just so fast and so powerful. Though the 13900K does deliver 3% better in the 1% lows, though at such a low difference, you could deem it as a bit of a draw anyway. Now at 1440p, it was exactly that, a draw, and didn't really provide anything to talk about. While 4K saw the CPU bottleneck being eliminated completely, and the Ryzen 9 7950X coming out as the better CPU, though only by just over 5% in the averages and a smaller 3% in the 1% lows. Dirt 5 finally gave us some data that had some significant changes between each processor, with a clear favour bias towards AMD. At 1080p, we saw our biggest margin yet of 6% going to the 7950X, with slightly better 1% lows as well. As we move up to 1440p, the gap shrinks slightly to just 4%, which could be argued as margin of error, and then again at 4K, the gap remains around the same at 5%, though it does see the 1% lows increase beyond that, again giving the win to the 7950X. Doom Eternal saw a change where the 13900K now comes out on top at 1080p with a 7% lead over AMD, though with a smaller 4% margin in the 1% lows. While at 1440p, both CPUs perform nigh on identically, with a slight upper hand in favour of the Intel i9 in the 1% lows, albeit by less than 2%. At 4K, both processors swap places, with the 7950X now in front by a margin of just over 4%, with some slightly stronger 1% lows as well. Now as we move on to F122, the trend continues, with the AMD processor leading the way across all three resolutions, though the 7950X did only manage to push ahead with very small leads, with the most noticeable being at 1440p with a gap of just over 2%, so you could easily call that again margin of error. Far Cry 6 saw things move around again, this time with some mixed results. At 1080p, the i9 13900K managed to push ahead by 4% in the averages and a slightly better 6% in the 1% lows. While at 1440p, the AMD 7950X fought back, though the gain is much lower at 1% over the Intel flagship, which actually came in with stronger 1% lows, even though the averages were worse. Then at 4K, which is where you'd like to think you'd be playing with an RTX 4090, the Ryzen processor pushes ahead by 7% when compared to the Core i9, with stronger 1% low figures as well. Forza Horizon 5 really doesn't give any data worth talking about, as all three resolutions showed no one processor leading over the other, though I guess you could argue that the Intel CPU delivered slightly stronger 1% lows, but nothing really of significance. As a talking point, you could say that if playing Forza Horizon 5, having one CPU over the other doesn't benefit you as a gamer in the slightest. Horizon Zero Dawn has always favoured AMD processors over the competition, and that's pretty evident here at all three resolutions. At 1080, we see a clear 11% lead in favour of the 7950X and a huge 20% gain in the 1% lows. At 1440, that lead shrinks to 5% in the averages and a 4% lead on the 1% lows, while 4K draws ever closer with only 1 frame per second separating them, though the 7950X does come with slightly stronger 1% lows, giving a 5% advantage to Team Red. Now onto one of the hottest titles of the year, and in Spider-Man Remastered, the 13900K storms ahead by a whopping 20% in the averages and a strong 15% lead in the 1% lows too. While at 1440p the 1% lows come within 2 FPS of each other, but the Intel still manages to push ahead by just over 6%. Then at 4K things take a complete 180, with the Ryzen 9 now storming ahead with a 15% lead over the i9, along with slightly stronger numbers in the 1% lows. Moving on to Microsoft Flight Sim, and before even getting started, it's worth stating how utterly CPU intensive this game really is. With that in mind, it's clear to see that that's the case across all 3 resolutions, where the only saving grace on a system like we have here really is to utilise the likes of DLSS to break through that barrier. That aside, though we are severely CPU limited, the Intel i9 still manages to push ahead by a small margin at 1080p, while displaying much better 1% lows of around 25% compared to AMD. Then at 1440p the i9 really comes into its own, pushing ahead by 19% and with a gap of 34% when looking at those all important 1% lows and the dips, which with the frame rates we're getting will actually be quite noticeable. At 4K the CPU bottleneck comes into play again, with both AMD and Intel CPUs giving us identical performance in both the averages and 1% lows. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the game, much like Horizon Zero Dawn, really favours AMD based processors, and at 1080p we can see that with a 14% lead given to the 7950X. Though what's more interesting is that the Intel i9 actually performs 10% better, again in those 1% lows. At 1440p, the 7950X manages to keep an 11% lead in the averages, while also stepping up its game in the 1% lows with a lead of 9%. At 4K, the AMD Ryzen CPU still manages to push ahead by a smaller margin of 8%, while also maintaining a healthy 11% lead in those 1% lows. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p had the 13900K coming out on top by a margin of 6%, while the 1% lows were slightly better at 8% more compared to AMD's flagship. At 1440p it was a much narrower fight with less than 3% in it, but the Intel did come in with significantly better 1% lows with a lead of 24%. While at 4K the battle came in neck and neck with a margin of error lead in favour of AMD. Finally, in Watch Dogs Legion at 1080p we see Intel taking the lead by such a small margin that we're going to chalk it up as a bit of a draw, with a slight advantage I guess to Intel in the 1% lows. At 1440p the lead grows slightly in favour by the i9 by 7%, while the lead in the 1% lows also increases now to 9%. Whereas our 4K results swapped around a bit, now with the 7950X coming in 2% faster than Intel, with 1% lows that are virtually the same. With 15 games out the way at various resolutions, it is worth looking at how things stack up across a bigger sample of games. With a total of 30 games at 1080p, we do see the i9 13900K pushing ahead slightly by around 2%, and the same in the 1% lows, which with such a low margin you could chalk up that as a margin of error. Though at 1080p, it's where we really see the CPUs being pushed to their limits, while the GPU takes a bit of a back seat. As we move up to 1440p, the results come in identical at 280 FPS in the overall average, with the Intel flagship just giving us a very marginal 1% lead in the 1% lows. Again, I'd see this as a draw, and margin of error through retesting could see this change slightly either way. Lastly, at 4K, things saw a fair bit of movement, much like we saw in the individual games, with the 7950X taking the lead with a 2% margin in the averages and almost a 3% lead in the 1% lows. Again, with such a small margin between it, I don't think you'd be disappointed with any of the CPUs tested here today, and it was clear to see that while some games favoured one CPU over the other, that really comes down to what game you play specifically, as other games favoured the other. And that's why looking at individual games accounts for some users, but to get a bigger picture, looking at overall averages across more games really makes a big difference. So some very interesting results in terms of the games tested and how close both CPUs were in 30 games in total. But with the Ryzen 9 7950X costing more, though deals can be had due to Black Friday, we do see some pretty stark differences with the cost per frame, where the 7950X at 1080p comes in around 15% more expensive overall. As we move up to 1440p, the gap does shrink slightly, though the 7950X still demands a 13% premium per frame compared to Intel's 13900K. While finally at 4K we do see the gap bridge ever closer, though the Ryzen 9 still commands an extra 10% when looking at the cost per frame. When we look over to the UK and cost per frame, it's a very similar story, with the AMD 7950X commanding an 18% higher premium per frame than the 13900K at 1080p, which is where you could argue the CPUs work the hardest. Though with an RTX 4090, there's always going to be a level of CPU bottleneck at all lower resolutions that, frankly, you just can't ignore. At 1440p, again, that lead narrows to 15%, which is still a substantial difference when looking at the cost per frame over the whole 30 games. Obviously, I invite you to do your own sums on a selection of games that we showed data here for today, but I wanted to show the best picture possible to appeal to the broadest spectrum of games. Then at 4K, the 7950X still comes in 13% more expensive per frame compared to the 13900K. But if the discounts for Black Friday are here to stay, then that gap across all three resolutions does draw ever closer. Now with both CPUs, we know being flagships that there has been a lot of talk regarding power draw and temperatures, and this is something quite interesting to touch on, as looking at the total system power draw for both CPUs, with an RTX 4090, it was always going to be on the high side due to the GPU used. But what we saw was that the Intel 13900K ended up using around 19% more power overall, namely down to a couple of titles that saw pretty huge variances between the two processors. But in most titles, there was still quite a lot more power being consumed overall. At 1440p, the gap narrowed slightly, with the Core i9 now only using 14% more power, which doesn't sound like a lot, but obviously does add up over time. Though if you are using an RTX 4090, it's likely not going to really bother you anyway. Then at 4K, the Intel Core i9 was still using around 11% more power, which again doesn't sound like much, but still ended up being around 20 to 40 more watts, which at a time where electricity costs are higher than ever, is definitely worth talking about, with the most noticeable point being in Riftbreaker, where the Intel CPU used a whopping 32% more power than the AMD 7950X, which I guess does skew our results ever so slightly, but it's still a popular title that was worth featuring. What that means for running costs is where we see the Intel coming in on average about 2 cents more per hour during pretty heavy productivity, and only 1 cent difference per hour when looking at gaming. While in the UK, the differences are quite a stark difference, with the Core i9 coming in around 44% more expensive to run per hour than the 7950X during Cinebench, though only saw just short of it being 10% more expensive to run during gaming. Now you'd like to think that power and temperatures do go hand in hand to some degree, and again that is the case, where the Intel Core i9 came in around 13% hotter at all three resolutions under an NZXT Z73 RGB AIO, which is no real cause for concern, but it's definitely something worth looking at if you're not planning to run a beefy cooler, as that would make quite a significant difference to your temperatures, which could lead to thermal throttling and, overall, less performance in game. So as always, a lot of data that we've gone through, and as mentioned, we will be putting up all of the charts up on our Patreon if you want to check that out. The link is down below. Now, I think it's fair to say that both CPUs are equally impressive, though the Intel does have an upper hand in certain areas, like the fact that it has efficiency cores. So for those who use their PC for work-related tasks and predominantly sit within browser windows and emails, you may find that you're going to kind of find that it costs less overall there. Though the AMD 7950X does manage to fight back quite aggressively in terms of load, using a boatload less power overall, which again then translates into temperatures too. Again, the temperatures didn't bother me too much, as we know the Intel CPU can get very hot without the need for thermal throttling. And I'd like to think that Intel have done the legwork to make sure they know what they're doing, and that it's no real cause for concern. Now the other area that Intel wins on is cost. Yes, at the time of filming this, AMD have made some tasty discounts, but whether they're going to stick around is anyone's guess. And that's why I based our figures on the pre-Black Friday prices. On top of that, moving to the 7950X and the AM5 platform is going to mean that DDR5 is a must, while Intel supports both DDR5 as well as DDR4 for those who may be on a restricted budget. Though if you are slapping down the kind of cash that both CPUs demand, it's unlikely that the word budget even comes into your thoughts. Now the big sticking point for Intel is that it was always a dead platform before it even got started in comparison to AMD, due to it having no future upgrade path, while AMD have already stated that AM5 will live on for quite some time, making it perfect for those wanting to move to potential 7000 X3D parts that are more than likely going to come next year. So I guess you could argue that paying more now will benefit you later, while Intel means saving a little now and paying more later. So really that comes down to personal preference, and again, what your budget allows for you. So with that, I'm going to remain kind of neutral, because there is actually an argument for both processors, and for very different reasons. In terms of gaming performance, you could argue that, yeah, they are identical. And for productivity, I invite you to check out our launch day coverage on both these processors, where we go through all of that for a better idea, if that's kind of what you're looking for. Now, in terms of power and temperatures, AMD have the winner. That's clear to see. And the same with looking to the future. But for now, Intel handles memory better and has the choice between DDR4 and DDR5. What I will say is that with the Black Friday discounts from AMD being fairly strong, may lead to, potentially, Intel retaliating and dropping prices on their parts. No matter what you're looking at, it could be worth waiting a little longer to kind of see what happens, especially with the likes of CES coming up around the corner very, very soon, which is kind of normally a hotspot for new products. And we could see new CPUs from AMD being announced, maybe non-X parts or even the X3D parts. So me personally, I'd wait for that. So let me know where your buying decision lies. Are you Team Blue, Team Red, or are you just abstaining and waiting for what's potentially around the corner? Let me know in the comment section. And that about wraps it up. If you like this video, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, definitely check out supporting us over on Patreon, where you'll get a ton of cool exclusive benefits, including access to all of our testing data, our super special bi-weekly game nights on our Discord, behind the scenes content, and much more. The link for that is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye bye.